Hello, and welcome to More Intelligent Tomorrow, a wide-ranging exploration of the potential impact of AI on the world around us, as envisioned by the future heroes of the human and machine intelligence revolution. Should AI personify itself? We'll discuss this and more with Fiona McEvoy on today's episode. And now, your host, Ben Taylor.
Fiona, thank you so much for being on this podcast and making time.
No worries. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I think for listeners, it'd be really fun to kick off your backstory. What's your career journey been to get here?
It's been a bit of a long and winding road, to quote a Beatles song. I really started off years ago studying arts and humanities. I did a couple of undergraduate degrees back in my native UK, and then sort of left all that behind and worked in campaigns and communications around kind of political activism, and ended up coming to the States and going back to school. So I had a kind of 10-year gap, and I'd always wanted to study philosophy because it had been a kind of ongoing interest of mine, and ended up really kind of burrowing into ethics as a topic. And being in San Francisco, I thought it'd be interesting to apply some of the ethical principles and structures that I was learning to thinking about some of the technologies that were coming out of Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and obviously the rest of the US and indeed the world. And I ended up writing my thesis on the ethics of big data. And from then, I was kind of a graduate with no job, and I started blogging. I started You the Data, which is my blog. And really just to keep the momentum going. So I was responding to stuff I saw in the media and thinking about, what the kind of ethical issues were around them. And people started reading it, which was really cool. And then, I continued to do academic writing, but now I still blog, I write in the media, and I get to do things like this, and I get to speak on panels and stuff. So yeah, it's been a bit of a strange trajectory, but a lot of fun, and and now the topic is burgeoning. It's huge, and it's in the media all the time, which is super gratifying for someone like me who started doing this a few years ago.
Have you picked a career that gets boring or stale, or do you feel like it's hard to keep up?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of people that now put a sharp lens on how is this going to affect us in the world as human beings? How is this going to change how we work? How we interact with our fellow, human beings, our families, our co-workers, and ultimately, are there going to be harms down the line? Because we've seen issues with, certainly with social media and sort of other technologies that have surfaced in recent years. And now there's a ton of people trying to predict and mitigate those effects. It's hard to keep up, but it's certainly never boring.
I have so many feelings about what you do for society, because I think you do a great service, because AI and technology are moving so quickly. I think a lot of people are naive. And so the articles that you write, I'm looking at one right now, Why Employee Surveillance is Not Okay. This is relevant. It's right now. Maybe let's discuss that for a minute. What are the issues that people are maybe unaware of that are happening today?
People aren't aware of surveillance at large, and a lot of that surveillance is now in the workplace, and tools that employees are using online, or I say using, that are surveilling them online and in their workplace, but also as we're working remotely, are sort of latent in the background. And a lot of people are working without realizing that their actions are being monitored, their keystrokes are being kind of checked, and their time at a particular workstation is being tracked, and they are ultimately being understood in terms of these metrics, and those metrics are being used to ascertain how good they are at their jobs. On the surface, that doesn't seem necessarily like something that is particularly pernicious, but if you think about the lack of awareness and how, I think I put in that piece that it feels as though people are almost being shepherded and observed like lab rats. I feel a lot of people would think that was an affront to human dignity. And that's one of the important angles of surveillance is, you could make an argument that, consequentially, it's a good thing to know how productive each individual person is. But I would say that you need to do that in a way that is that honors human dignity. And also there are issues around whether you can actually quantify these things anyway, right? Just because I'm not always at my workstation doesn't mean I'm an unproductive person. Similarly, I could be chained to my workstation from 9 in the morning till 9 at night and be procrastinating. And so I worry that the metrics themselves aren't that reliable, and we're sort of deferring to algorithms for something that is ultimately quite a nuanced topic.
That's a great point, because if you're a creative like yourself and you want to go to the beach and take your notebook and write some notes and brainstorm some of these concepts, with the analytics data tracking, you would get no credit for that.
When we boil everything down to quantifiables, we lose a lot. And I'm just concerned that we will lose some of our humanity in treating human beings kind of like production-centric robots. Who's to say what full productivity even looks like? You know, we aren't machines. And we can't work at 100% of the time. We need downtime. That's proven to, you know, to kind of take the stress off and recharge. And these systems don't seem to make allowance for that, from what I understand.
So the robots want us to be robots.
Yeah, the robots want us to be robots and work at maximum capacity all the time. But some people just want to do, you know, their expense sheet or whatever it is and zone out. And I think we should acknowledge the value of time away from work.
The problem with ethics is it's gray, and you can think of outliers on both sides that'll pull hard. And so maybe a good one to come up. You've talked about the concerns with privacy around remote work, which I think a lot of people will agree. That seems pretty clear. Let's talk about COVID data for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So with COVID, shouldn't everyone be giving up as much data as possible in the spirit of stopping COVID spread? So where do you draw the line when it comes to sharing medical data, tracking data? I know if there's been pushback on the Bluetooth app with the Android and the iPhone.
I think it's a really complex topic because, to a degree, I think people will agree that we should relinquish a certain amount of our personal privacy in the name of tracking and curing or vaccinating against this, you know, incredibly potent force that is coronavirus that's changed all of our lives in a very short period. That said, I think there are a couple of issues in that we don't have guarantees that in giving this information over, we will automatically or in a short time receive some kind of solution to the problem. And it's not that I'm arguing that we should get guarantees before we do that, but I worry that the amount of data that's being demanded of us, does this open the door to really, really pervasive surveillance on an ongoing basis? Because look, it might be that it takes a long time to get any kind of vaccine or cure to this. And even once we do, we aren't guaranteed that there won't be mutations or similar viruses or diseases that occur in the future. And I think there'll be an argument made that we should maybe monitor and surveil people and keep their personal data. And it's not just health data; it's where people are, who they've seen, where they've been. It's, you know, incredibly personal data about movements and locations that you know has simply never been tracked before on this kind of scale. And so I worry that we're walking kind of blindly without any real reassurances into a future where we are monitored, tracked, and understood on an incredibly forensic level. And, you know, we can see this, and I hate to always go to China, but we can see this kind of tracking in China already. And this is the sort of stuff I'm talking about with the social credit. If someone understands every action or has collected data on every action that you've made, every visit that you've made, and all of your health data to boot, then they know an awful lot about you and they can make certain assignations based on that. And I find that concerning on a level that I think a lot of people do. I don't know if you agree, Ben.
I think the scope creep is the main thing that I definitely agree with. So if it's in the spirit of stopping this disease, that sounds fairly safe, but you don't know how people will use the data when you get scope creep. A lot of times we think about protecting the future we have now, and you're suggesting we have to protect the future that could come.
Yeah, precisely. Exactly.
I'd love to kind of find the edge cases where you feel like, well, I guess we have to give up privacy for this reason. I've got kids. If one of my kid was kidnapped and if there was a suspect, and I have security cameras and they're very, very good, let's say they're 8K resolution or 16K, and I can see your face. I don't know who you are. Would you want to live in a society where I could take your face to the police department and then they would tell me who you are?
I think so the case that you're given is an interesting one, and I think parents in that predicament obviously would say, "Be done with your ethics. Who cares? Find our kid." And I think the same is true actually of lots of victims of crime. You get people who, having had, kind of giving a gory example, but it's the one that springs to mind, having had a child or a relative murdered, would happily see the perpetrators hang, for want of a better term. That doesn't mean that it's the rational way to proceed. Emotions can sometimes blur rationality, and thinking about ethics, we have to think about, not just the test case. We have to think about, the greatest good for the greatest number if we're thinking about consequentialism or utilitarianism, and actually having this reaction whereby we monitor everybody, or we punish perpetrators to the full extent of the law on instinct because the crime is bad. That feels like a kind of reactionary approach, which ultimately doesn't serve the whole of society that well, because if you're accused of being the criminal or the perpetrator in this case, then that's not a great place to be, just so that just so the system is able to run as the victims of crime would wish. That's not to say that the victims of crime aren't right in wanting justice. It's just how we perceive justice and how that process kind of plays out, I guess.
So you've been doing a great job raising awareness around protecting our rights with advancing technologies and changing ethics, which are constantly changing. Do you ever think in the future that you could find yourself defending robot ethics?
This is a super, super interesting topic. And I think a lot of people think that harms can only be committed against a robot if it were sentient, if it were conscious, right? And I don't believe, and I know we probably disagree on this, I certainly don't believe in my lifetime that I'm going to see a sentient robot, one that understands what consciousness is. But that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't grant things rights and we shouldn't protect things, right? So we protect animals, many of which don't have the same cognitive abilities as a human. We don't like to see those animals tortured. And so I think, as robots and AI become more embedded in our lives and are able to affect the world that we live in and our nature and the way that we interact, I think potentially they should have some level of rights and privileges, and they should be protected against being, destroyed unnecessarily or whatever we perceive those harms to be. And it seems, I think even saying it out loud now, it does seem a little crazy. But we do grant rights to the things that we love and we care about and are important to our world. And I can see quite clearly that AI and robotics is going to be incredibly important to our world. And so it feels like the natural and rational extension. But I don't know if you agree with me there.
No, I think that's a great example. And I like that you mentioned kind of the pet analogy, because if I have a pet dog that I've raised for a few years, and if you intentionally kill it, you've done harm to me. You've obviously done harm to the dog. You killed the dog, but you've done emotional damage to me. This has been a household pet, and there should be some consequence for that. And now you can see the robot analogy. If I have Spot, the robot dog, and if I've invested my experience into Spot, training it, it's become a member of the family. Is it some super intelligence that you would respect? Maybe not. But my experience is tied to this device, and you destroying it, you've now done the same emotional damage to me as you would have if it were a dog. So maybe that's the first step. And then the second step is something that is a lot more confusing, where we don't have good answers for it.
Yeah, I think it's something, as I say, that I think a lot of philosophers, there's a guy called David Gunkel who has written a book on robot rights and has kind of thought through all possibilities on this. And he's a really interesting person to listen to. And he doesn't arrive at any real solid conclusion, but it's definitely not something to be dismissed out of hand. Like you say, if you have an emotional dependence on something, and any other type of dependence, if it means something structurally in your life or in society's life or in your family's life, or however you want to think about the particular AI or robot, then the kind of wanton destruction of it does seem wrong. It seems wrong. It seems like you're committing a harm. But I guess going back to the old adage, where you have rights, you also have responsibilities. We'd also have to think about how we construe responsibilities when we're thinking about potentially a non-sentient or only partially sentient artifact. And I think that's kind of tough.
So Fiona, you've talked about this concept of personification and why there are problems with it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to set the stage really quickly in the future. So Mark Cuban has said AI will usher in the world's first trillionaire. And let's just say 20 years from now, that individual, him or her, they're manufacturing droids that are in your house. They do your dishes, they pick up socks, they'll read your kids a bedtime story, they could even be a babysitter. What are your thoughts about that and personification? If I had humor, wit, and empathy, what concerns do you have?
I love the convenience of it. It sounds like kind of Rosie from the Jetsons. My concerns are that we're learning to emote or have a kind of emotional relationship with an artifact that, although it can do quite a good impression of having emotions and caring about you, is just an artifact and doesn't care about you. And actually, there is no reciprocity where there appears to be reciprocity. And I think for most of us, that's okay. But I think there are definitely vulnerable categories, and children amongst those categories, not all children, but some children in particular, who could become overly attached to something that just quite simply doesn't love them back. And I worry that there's something destructive about that. Relationships are really precious things, and we've been developing them for millennia, and they work in structures and they're incredibly complex. And I just worry that having a meaningful relationship with something that is it isn't sentient, it isn't conscious, and it doesn't love you back is something that is, as I say, potentially destructive.
Well, it does love you back as long as you pay your monthly lease payment.
That's not love, you see. That's not love.
So the thought is you're actually bringing a super manipulator into your house. So almost a car salesman, a shady car salesman on steroids that knows everything about human psychology. They understand you like empathy. They understand you like consistency. They learn what you like. And it's all in the spirit of a business.
That worries me not only from the fact that information is being commercialized and used to sell you stuff, but it also makes us really predictable, right? Like, it's in the interests of the system for you to go through the same mundane reactions to things, to go through the same day-to-day routine, to be predictable. And so it has an interest in keeping you predictable. And I don't think that that's great for, human character. And we like to change and evolve and try new things. And we do that naturally. And to have something in the home that tries to stifle that kind of lust to do something new feels sad. And again, it's kind of going back to this making us into robots, right? It's easier if we're predictable, but I don't want to be predictable.
I love that response because it hits on something that's very sad, because the more predictable you become, the dumber you are. And so it's robbing you of your intelligence. Mm-hmm. So if you're perfectly predictable, are you even living? Are you sensory response? And so the thing you've talked about in this podcast is what makes us the most human is at risk.
That's right. If you think that what makes you who you are, what constitutes you, is the choices that you make, what your hairstyle is, who your partner is, what you named your kids, where you went to college, what you buy when you go grocery shopping, then to have something else try to predict and then essentially determine those things over and over again somehow, for me, erodes your character, erodes you as a human being, or even worse, kind of takes ownership of it a little bit in a way that seems to undermine your human autonomy, your agency to be you in the world. And I think that agency and human autonomy is at risk at the moment because we have so many things bearing down on us that wish that we were more predictable and are incentivized to make us more predictable. And we are nudged and shepherded by advertising and those kind of things. Thinking about kids growing up, we need to be conscious of that and teach them to resist, these kind of nudges that are becoming more like shoves sometimes. And make sure that we do continue to do things that are occasionally random in order to become less predictable and to experience different types of things in the world that are available to us, and not to narrow our horizon of choice and make it kind of sad and samey.
In the future, 50 years from now, you and I are both gray. And if we're meeting over coffee, and if I tell you I have a baby consciousness in my briefcase, is that equivalent to a nuclear weapon in my briefcase? Is there something fascinating about it because it's unpacking what makes us human? Or is that a terrible thing?
I would be highly skeptical, first of all. I know
that's what it's parlor tricks. So
and I would say, how have you done this? Because we don't really know how the human brain works. So how on earth have you been able to replicate it in silicone? And how did that happen? Did it just emerge, the consciousness, or did you build it in somehow? And after you'd given acceptable answers to all those questions, I just feel as though the ways in which it could be used and deployed are the scary things. How humans might seek to deploy an artificial consciousness is my first worry. And I also, just the big question of why. I don't know why we need to create artificial consciousness. We have consciousness. It abounds in the natural world. We should be thinking of cool tools that we can use to make the world better rather than replicating what we already have, I think.
Fiona, thank you so much for being on this podcast. I always love talking to you. You've given me a lot of new things to think about, a lot of new problems that are coming. And I appreciate that you're fighting the fight to figure this out.
No worries. It was great to have a wide-ranging discussion. Always great to speak with you.